let's say that you were standing in a forest. Let's make it a really diverse one, the Amazon. Every creature that you see is the result of a 3.5 billion year winning streak of reproduction. And for almost every creature that you see, that winning streak is about to come to an end, right? That's just statistically true. Most creatures are dead ends very soon, but by virtue of their having arrived here, we know that they have never lost till this point, right? They've arrived. That's why evolution is so effective, right? It's effective because of that massive edit each and every generation that eliminates all but the ones in which the best characteristics and good luck have come together and gotten them one more time through this intense bottleneck, right? So evolution is a very powerful process for that reason, because of the constant massive editing. Economics isn't quite that effective, but it has the same characteristic. Now, when we say that a creature fits into a niche, what do we mean? Well, what we mean is that there is some abstraction, some way to exist that is there. And creatures, by exploring that space, right? Those creatures with a little bit more of this, a little bit longer limbs, right? A little bit more acute eyes, whatever it is, longer snouts, whatever it happens to be, the creatures come to fit that niche in the same way that a liquid comes to fit the shape of whatever container you put it in. So the point is, evolution, whether it's economic or biotic, explores the shapes of containers. And it tells us what the shape of the container is by what works, what sticks, what we see there. And all right, the reason this comes up is I was, for the third time in a short number of weeks, confronted by the system for COVID testing that one has to engage in to participate in certain activities. These are tests that you source within a certain number of hours before you get on a plane or attend an event, or in cases in Portland, some places you would have to do it to go to a restaurant if you can't prove you're vaccinated. Mm-hmm.
Most recently to get Toby admission to camp.
Yes, mm-hmm. Toby admission to camp. We have also done it. I've now done it in 3 countries. Mm-hmm. I've done it in the US a couple times. I've done it in Britain, and we've done it in the Bahamas. Mm-hmm. Each time the experience is the same. Mm-hmm. It's very bureaucratic, but surprisingly efficient.
It's strange. Talking about COVID testing makes us both cough.
Yeah, it does. But the point is, one goes in and one fears that somebody is going to jam a swab way up into your sinuses. Mm-hmm. But in fact, it's not. It doesn't go in so deep. In fact, they'll hand you the swab and you do it yourself. And it does raise a question. I mean, for one thing, you and I have both had COVID. I have yet to successfully test positive. We know that we've had COVID because, for example, you and I, one of us gave it to the other, and then you lost your sense of smell.
I had anosmia. Yeah.
Right, which is really the good test.
Yeah.
But, at least for the antigen tests, it didn't come up positive for us. So that's interesting. Lab work is difficult. These tests are not particularly good. In fact, one of the things that we don't know is how good these tests even are, and good at what? How good are they for one variant to the next, right? We don't know these questions. But the point that I want to make is that there is a niche now for a service. That service ostensibly is about testing for COVID. And in principle, this is a good idea. COVID is a dangerous disease, right? Much more dangerous than the case fatality rate would have you understand. Trying to control its spread is a good idea. Knowing who has it is a good element in a program to control its spread from one part of the country to the next, from one country to the next. It makes sense. But what has emerged in this niche is a racket, right? A low quality testing service that is very expensive, right? The tests in the US cost $300 a pop if you need them on short notice. And you do need them on short notice because people say you need it within 48 hours of travel. And in principle, that's a good idea, right? So that you have a good sense that everybody who arrives has just tested negative and therefore is likely to remain negative. In principle, it's a great idea. But the point is, what you've got is something that is exploring the dimensions of this niche. And one of the elements of this niche is that it is going to reward poor testing rather than high quality testing. If you have COVID, you test negative, you go to whatever the event is, and it turns into a super spreader event. What are the chances that anybody is tracking which lab failed to detect your COVID? Right? So the point is the incentive.
Yeah, on top of the event now having a super spreader event to mitigate the downstream effects of, they're going to go and do due diligence on every single person's COVID test? No, they're not.
Right. They're not. What's
the data
more,
exist, but
somebody you'd have to set up something like an agency in order to figure out which labs were more likely to miss active COVID, right? You would need a series of super spreader events, and then you would chase them back to potentially organizations that had run the test badly, to protocols that didn't work, right? But no such oversight appears to exist anywhere. And so the point is...
And without which, I mean, this is where you're going. Without which it's pure theater.
It's worse than pure theater, because what it does is it inhabits the space that a good...
It's expensive theater, though. It's lucrative theater.
Lucrative.
Yeah, it's expensive for us. Lucrative,
it fills the space in the environment where a good testing program would go. So if you had the idea of, well, you know what? It would be really great if we had good labs that gave good tests, especially, hey, maybe even at a good price, right? Well, the question is, economically speaking, which of these things is going to win that niche, right? Is it the one where you're likely to get a test that says you're COVID positive? Is it the very sensitive, high quality test that's going to win out? Probably not, because if you're in the position of getting one of these tests, then you know you're rooting for a negative result, right? You want to go to the thing. You want to get on the airplane. You want to go to the place that you've got reservations. You don't want a positive test. And so the point is, there is competition to deliver you an answer that you want. That is going to increase the number of super spreader events. It's going to increase the amount of COVID, the difficulty of controlling it, the number of variants that are going to circulate around the world. And if you tried to do it right, you would lose in competition with these folks who have that niche filled, right? And so...
Yeah, this is a place where market forces fail us.
Well, let's put it this way. They don't have to.
Well, they have.
Right.
Because all of the testing centers within a particular geographic area are in direct competition with one another. And so that testing center, which had access to or did due diligence on actually doing providing more reliable test results, and thus providing fewer false negatives, would lose in competition.
And there's a question about how far up this scales. In other words, the system that created the niche, how interested is it in controlling COVID versus appearing to be very active in controlling COVID without bothering? And, it bears mention that at least one part of this system is making so much money from COVID that it has a perverse incentive, right? Is the moral decency of the people in charge of pharma so good that it overwhelms their fiscal benefit from not controlling COVID and delivering lousy remedies that are expensive and mandated and paid for by government, right? I don't know. Maybe they're exceedingly good people, but... All of them, right? Or, even if you imagine that that's true, all right? So you have multiple companies. Let's say 9 out of 10 are run by exceedingly moral people who just would never think of doing...
Somehow their boards are cool with this.
Their boards are cool, even though it is a violation of their fiduciary responsibility to their shareholders. But all it takes is the one company that isn't run by those people, one company that's just simply run by business people, right? And that company will win, and then it will take over the industry. So basic point is, hey, look, you get whatever the niche is, right? You don't expect, when you pour water into a glass, you don't expect it to inhabit half the glass and leave half the glass empty. It will fill whatever shape you've given it. And the point is, the niches are what they are. The businesses will discover the shape of the niche. Those that are better able to explore and figure out where the opportunities are that aren't so cool but nonetheless are lucrative, those businesses will win out in competition. And so we get these things.
So check this out, though. I just read, and I don't think I figured out where it is before our show here today, but I just read that as of tomorrow, as of June 12th, the CDC has declared, and I question why the CDC gets to declare anything, anytime, anywhere, ever again. But I just don't think they have the authority. They're not that kind of an agency. But the CDC has declared that as of June 12th, people coming to the U.S. do not need to have a negative COVID test, which is interesting in light of all of this, that the U.S. is saying, yep, or I don't know if the U.S. is saying, the CDC is saying, the thing's changed. This is no longer a necessary part of the protocol.
Right, which could mean a lot of different things. It could be, so my claim is that the COVID testing regime is a racket, right?
Yes.
The idea is it looks like a COVID testing regime, but really it's a rubber stamping mechanism where you pay $300 for the rubber stamp, and the chances that they catch, your active infection are, at least lower than they should be.
It reminds me of getting research permits in tropical countries back when I was actively doing. You didn't have to do it as much because you were often working within a field station that took care of a lot of the logistics for you. But I ended up having to get independent permits in 3 different countries, in Latin America and Madagascar. And I mean, you were there for some of the wrangling with bureaucrats in Madagascar. I got asked for things like I literally got asked for a Land Rover. I'm like, at that point, I made $13,000 a year. I'm like, do I look like I have a Land Rover? But
doesn't hurt to ask.
Doesn't hurt to ask, yeah. And one day we were told to come back yet again because the guy with the rubber stamp was gone. The next day, the guy was there, but the key to the office was with someone else, and then it just went on and on. But anyway, the rubber stamping. This rubber stamping reminds me of incoherent bureaucratic procedures in very poor countries where local dudes are just trying to make a buck.
Yes. The problem is in the banana republics, so-called, you can see this, right? And the irony of the power of the guy with the rubber stamp and the fact that the guy with the rubber stamp makes so little money that it would be impossible. If somebody's going to extract $1 million of lumber out of a forest they're not supposed to be cutting lumber from, and the person who has the rubber stamp makes $10,000 a year, it's not hard to change that guy's picture enough that he'll look the other way.
Yeah. So that's at least when I was working in Madagascar, that number would have been way lower.
Yeah.
Just Madagascar was so poor. Yes, a Land Rover was a very big ask. But I believe in that case, I came back with a bottle of Johnny Walker, and that was good.
That was sufficient.
Yeah.
So, but I wanted to point to a shinier, fancier version of a closely related racket, because really my point is, you can see it with the COVID thing. It's new enough. And because we're interacting with it and learning what this system looks like, it's like, oh, this couldn't possibly work. Yeah. Right. But there are other versions of it. So one of them that surprised me during the COVID pandemic was the discovery of how the safety testing of pharmaceuticals actually works. And, this is the second time I've encountered weirdness in that realm. The first time being about telomeres and mouse evolution, which I will just point out the story there. I don't want to go too deep because it would take a lot of explaining. But I discovered as a graduate student that the mice in the colonies that supply our scientific establishment, including our drug safety testing apparatus, those mice had evolved to the container formed by the market for laboratory mice. And so the point was, look, if you're going to breed laboratory mice, you want to produce as many mice per unit of effort and shelter and food as you can. And that economic pressure to produce new mice as cheaply as possible causes breeders to breed young mice and not old mice. And that simple fact elongated the telomeres of mice and gave them essentially no protection from tumors and a essentially infinite capacity to replace damaged tissue, which...
a selective force that effectively moved all of the negative effects of all the drugs that were being tested into later stages of life.
Right. And so the problem, when I discovered that, and I discovered it, I predicted it from theory. Carol Greider then tested it and established that indeed wild mice did not have long telomeres, which was not obvious at the time. But the point was, when I found that, I naively believed that what would happen next is everybody would go, And they would realize that their science was all polluted by the mice they had been using, and that their drug safety testing was allowing dangerous drugs to make it to market. And there was going to be a massive effort to retest drugs, a massive effort to figure out how this had polluted what we understood about wound healing and aging and cancer and everything else. And it didn't happen, right? Now,
Crickets.
I think, so why the crickets? One reason, I believe, is that pharma and everything connected to it realized that it had a mechanism for making drugs that weren't especially safe look very safe. In fact, if you give a poisonous drug to a mouse that's going to die of cancer but has an infinite capacity for repair, if the poison isn't so poisonous that it kills the mouse outright, it may actually make them live longer because it functions as chemotherapy. Since cancer cells are in the process of always dividing, they are more vulnerable than regular cells. And so that is a result I've seen several times where a drug paradoxically makes the animals live longer and seems super great. But the point is, no, that won't translate to humans. Nonetheless, the point is the mice adapted to an economic niche, which has very real biological consequences. The racket I wanted to point to that isn't particularly visible, right? The COVID testing racket is visible to us. The one that surprised me, doesn't surprise me in retrospect, but surprised me when I first came to understand that it existed, was that when we say Pfizer tested its drug for safety, that's generally not what we mean. Pfizer doesn't test the drug. What Pfizer does is it contracts those who specialize in the testing of drugs to do these tests. And the problem is, if you imagine an outfit that's awesome at testing drugs and detecting safety signals that are really important versus one that sucks at it by design, the point is Pfizer has an interest in finding the one that's going to give it the equivalent of the rubber stamp. And so there's economic competition, even if Pfizer didn't know what it was doing. Right? To the extent that it gives business to those that have a protocol that is most likely to miss safety signals, right? Then it means that Pfizer doesn't have its fingerprints on it. It means that its drug makes it to market because it looks safer than it is. And this is especially true in the case where you've got immunity from liability. Right? Because there's no way for the system to come back and correct it. So the evolution of protocols that don't work, that's what you're going to get if the shape of the container is such that it rewards those protocols, which we can see, how many other places are there? I've now described 2, right? The mouse version is a third. So how many places has the shape of the container caused us to put together something that looks like a scientific protocol that just doesn't do what it's supposed to do?
The 2 that you described are the COVID testing,
the running of clinical trials to see how safe and effective drugs are, where the companies that actually do that work are rewarded for pleasing their employers, right? Or those who have contracted them. And then the mouse thing, I believe, happened inadvertently. I'm all but certain that nobody planned that. But having discovered that it existed, the incentive to get rid of that and get mice that could actually tell you when a drug was dangerous, that incentive wasn't there.
Yeah, no, I mean, certainly in the case of the mice, by far the most parsimonious explanation for how those breeding protocols got started was just simple economics.
And in fact, that is reflected by the fact when I found that, I went looking because that has nothing to do with mice or science. What it has to do with is any protocol in it has to be a small animal. It won't work with a large one because a large one will get cancer and won't live to reproduce. But in a small enough animal, if you breed for economic efficiency, you get this result. And so we've seen it in mice, rats, Asian hamsters,
Mongolian
chickens.
Gerbils.
Yeah.
Right? Like there's
Asian
a few
hamsters.
Oh, is that Mongolian gerbils? Is that the same thing?
I'm agnostic on Mongolian gerbils.
Okay. I know there's a lot of anyway, doesn't matter. There are a few of these. What was the? Oh, you said chickens?
Chickens. Yeah.
So a few rodents and I guess a bird that
should happen with
where we see a species basically being designed with some intentionality to be a good lab animal.
Right. Really, it's, anytime.
And the intention is to be a good lab animal. And the failure is, complex systems, unintended consequences, antagonistic pleiotropies, which is specifically what you found with regard to cancer and senescence, with regard to telomere length, which is to say, early effects that are good will mask late effects that are bad.
Yep.
From the same gene.
I mean, the basic point is, look, it should have been obvious that your laboratory colony is an environment every bit as much as a forest or your basement,
right.
or a grain silo, right? And so whatever the forces are in that environment is going to shape that critter, because you haven't done anything to reduce the tendency of those in the colony that are better adapted to outcompete those that are worse adapted.
Exactly.
So you're going to get exactly...
Which we, in quotes, took advantage of in doing serial passaging research and, gain of function research with regard to, the intention was not to affect the ferrets there, if it was ferrets or whatever it was, but actually specifically to enhance functionality and through monitoring mutations and choosing which ones we liked in, for instance, viruses.
Right. So the basic point is we selected for, presumably, if what we seem to be able to infer from the nature of SARS-CoV-2 is the result of serial passaging in tissues and creatures, presumably in Wuhan, those who ran those experiments were serially passaging them to create certain changes, but they inevitably selected for other changes they weren't even thinking about, like adaptation to the laboratory environment, adaptation to be able to jump evolutionary gaps because they were running it through different creatures and tissues.
Potentially adaptation for very rapid change.
Yeah.
Rapid variants, for instance.
Yeah. So anyway, I'm not sure how to sum all this up except to say that welcome to complex systems. Our environments will cause anything that has the characteristics of an evolving lineage or creature to find the shape of the niche and inhabit it, which means you need to be, if you did want to fix the testing regime, if you did want to fix pharma's protocols, what you would have to do is disincentivize rubber stamp protocols and incentivize the discovery of information that actually caused dangerous drugs not to emerge, caused people with COVID not to get on airplanes, those things. And it's not inconceivable that you could build those incentives. But the problem is that those with control tend to be those who are benefiting from the structure as it stands. And so, we saw this week, I believe it was CDC recommending boosters for 5-year-olds. And in fact, the absurdity of this has been described in public, but the basic point was the whole apparatus is set up to deliver that answer, which is why it delivered that answer, despite the fact that there's no real medical argument for it and a very strong argument against it.
And increasingly, actually even hitting the mainstream media, we have, higher rates of COVID in fully boosted people than in, so-called fully vaccinated people, which not boosted. So. Right.
No, but look, the system is going to evolve. If you give incentives, capture will create an incentive for those who are supposedly regulated to generate the equivalent of a rubber stamp upstream of them. You should not be surprised when that rubber stamps things, right? You should expect that. And what we are dealing with is a captured system in which the shapes of these niches are all paradoxical, because the purpose of those niches isn't to enhance the public's health, it's to do something else, right? Basically, you get regulators whose purpose is to enhance the well-being of the shareholders of the corporations that have captured the regulators, right? Not surprising, right? Maddening, but not surprising.